A look into how the NFL might handle the recent COVID-19 outbreak in its locker rooms, the Seahawks prepare for a Week 5 battle with the struggling 1-3 Vikings, and Climate Pledge Arena gets one step closer to welcoming the Kraken in 2021. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 9 of Around the Sound. We're keeping it rolling here at Around the Sound. We have plenty of things to talk about today. Plenty more stuff is in the news. We obviously will talk about the COVID-19 outbreak that keeps spreading further every day as it seems in the NFL. But before we get to all of that, I want to make sure everybody follow me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas. Keep up with everything that I'm involved in. If you already do follow me on Twitter, you probably saw that I got the opportunity to be a guest on a local soccer show here around where I go to school. And on the show, we talked about everything from MLS to EPL. It's about 45 minutes long. So if you haven't already, go take a look and watch or listen to that. It was great. I really enjoyed being able to be on their show, and I hope I get another opportunity to go on there again. Make sure you also follow the Instagram for the podcast at Around the Sound Seattle. Don't miss a beat on what's going on around here. Don't miss an opportunity to submit your question in a future Q&A, or if we do any other listener interaction-based segments in the future. So follow at Around the Sound Seattle on Instagram. As always, you can go to YouTube at PTOM Media, that's PTHOM Media, to watch Around the Sound, or you can listen to Around the Sound. Every episode of Around the Sound is available wherever you like to get your podcast. And last but not least, before we get to the show, if you like listening to Around the Sound, if you like listening to me babble on a mic for hours on end, make sure to tell your friends. I'm trying to grow this podcast, grow my listener base, and it really helps me out. So let's talk about first the Thursday night game that we saw between the Bucs and the Bears. We saw a rematch of the Super Bowl 52 quarterbacks, both on different teams. In Super Bowl 52, we saw Nick Foles, the backup quarterback to Carson Wentz at the Eagles, take down, sort of in an upset, Tom Brady. Remember, that was the Philly special Super Bowl that we had where Nick Foles caught a touchdown over Tom Brady, who is now on the Buccaneers. Nick Foles gets another one over Tom Brady here on this week's Thursday Night Football. And the question that I kind of want to ask a little bit after this game is Tom Brady finally washed? I think the main reason that Tom Brady departed from New England in this past year was that he wanted to prove he could win a Super Bowl or win anything, frankly, without Bill Belichick. There's plenty of critics, and I would put myself into this category, that classify Tom Brady as somewhat of a system quarterback. I think Bill Belichick is one of the smartest, if not the smartest coach that has ever coached in the NFL, and I think a lot of critics of Tom Brady's success are saying that Tom Brady maybe isn't the GOAT because most of his success can be attributed to the system that he played in and how well Bill Belichick was able to use him, and not only that, but how powerhouse the teams were that Tom Brady got to play on. All of the great players that Tom Brady had around him, all of the great offensive lines throughout the years that were able to protect him, keep him clean, keep him playing in the NFL as a quarterback over 20 years, and all the great defenses he had playing on the other side of the ball that allowed him essentially to win all of those Super Bowls. Now he goes to Tampa Bay. He has an extremely overrated coach in Bruce Arians that everybody likes to talk about as being some great messiah in NFL coaching, which I don't really fall trapped or fall victim to those types of arguments. I don't think that this Buccaneers team is particularly great. They have not played too many great opponents so far. I think they've got the Chargers and the Panthers, and now they lost to the Bears, who, while the Bears are 4-1, which is really a frightening statistic, they're really not that good. Neither of these teams are particularly that great. They're both sort of 3-1 imposters heading into this game, and the Bears are certainly 4-1 imposters. This was a team that started Mitchell Trubisky at quarterback for the first 2.5 games of its season before they finally got behind Nick Foles. And Nick Foles is obviously a better quarterback than Mitch Trubisky, but I still don't know if Nick Foles and the rest of the Bears team is really in a position to compete against some of the best teams, not just in the NFC, say teams like the Seahawks or the Saints, but teams even in the NFC North. I think that the Packers are probably going to run away with that division once all of those teams begin playing each other. But the funniest moment of this game easily was when Tom Brady at the end of the game thought he had an extra down. The Bucs were down 1 or 2. A field goal could have won it for them, I believe. Marching down the field, essentially. They were near midfield, but still on their own half. Tom Brady has to run up and clock it on second down, so gets the third down. And when you clock the ball, you spike it, you lose a down. And a lot of times, quarterbacks, when you're in the fourth quarter, you're running a 2-minute drill and you have to spike the ball. You can, it's rare, but we saw it this game, a quarterback and an offense losing track of what down they were actually on, because when you clock the ball, it doesn't really feel like a play, because as soon as the ball snapped, you're throwing it into the ground to stop the clock. But it doesn't really feel like a play because you already are moving on to the next down. So you move on to third down. A pass was, I think, dropped on third down, and you get to fourth down. Tom Brady sort of takes a hero shot 20, 25 yards down the field. Receiver's not really open. He's not able, whoever the receiver was, I think it was the backup tight end for the Buccaneers, whoever's playing behind Rob Gronkowski these days, drops the ball, doesn't really drop it. It was great defense played by the Bears. Almost an uncatchable ball, not really a smart decision, and then the camera pans back to Brady after the turnover on downs. Keep in mind, that was fourth down. That ended the game. The Buccaneers had no more timeouts. The Bears were able to take a knee and escape with a victory after that. But the camera pans back to Tom Brady after the pass was deflected and it was a turnover on downs, and he's holding up a 4 as if it was about to be fourth down. And he has the most confused, disappointed look on his face, and he couldn't really believe that he had miscounted the down at first. And it was really funny to watch Tom Brady walk over to the referee and ask, like, hey, buddy, what down was that? I was under the impression that was third down and we had another chance. But no, Tom Brady lost the game off of being confused, essentially, about what down that play was. If you think that play's third down, that throw makes a little bit more sense, because you want to take a hero shot, you want to get the ball downfield, and you have another down sitting in your back pocket. It's 4-down territory, 30 seconds left in the game. But on fourth down, that throw makes no sense. At that point, you're just trying to pick up the first down, and then if you can, get out of bounds. But making that sort of throw over the middle of the field doesn't really make much sense. Tom Brady miscounting the downs essentially lost this game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it's still funny to see Tom Brady lose. Everybody loved to see Tom Brady lose when he was playing at the evil empire, which is the New England Patriots. But now that he has moved on, it is still fun for a lot of the rest of the NFL, fans of other teams around the NFL, to watch Tom Brady continue to lose. I would not suspect that the Buccaneers, similar to the Bears, I think the Buccaneers and the Bears are both teams that could sneak into the playoffs in the NFC, but I still think the talent gap between the Bucs and the Bears, who are both have positive records in the NFL right now, the talent gap between those two teams and the Seahawks, Packers, and Saints, even the Saints are closer, inching closer to that Bucs and Bears category, but the Seahawks and the Packers especially are really, really good, and I don't see any of the teams in that next tier of the Bucs and the Bears able to upset the apple cart in sort of the top dog tier of the NFC. So let's move on now to sort of the NFL COVID problem. This is kind of the main point that I wanted to go over in today's episode of Around the Sound, and the NFL has a serious COVID problem now. The Tennessee Titans have had dozens of positive tests at this point. It's up into the mid-20s between all of the players and staff. The Pats have also been hit with a few positive tests, but it looks like the Patriots still will be able to sort of play all their games without being forced to reschedule at least one of them. The Titans game last week against the Steelers was rescheduled. They moved around 1 or 2 bye weeks between the Steelers and the Ravens and were able to ultimately reschedule that game for week 7. But this was bound to happen, and I think the NFL went into the season knowing that, and they came up with a protocol and a set of rules and regulations. We saw that in week 1, where some of the coaches like Pete Carroll and like Bill Belichick were fined. I think it was Bill Belichick were fined for not wearing their mask properly for the entire length of the game. But the NFL, it's really hard to reschedule games in the NFL. If a team has a bye week, like the Titans had their bye week in week 7, it was easy to reschedule a game because you could just replace the current week, which was week 4 last week, with whatever the bye week was supposed to be, and then they were able to move the Steelers and Ravens to week 8, since both of those teams were supposed to have their bye week on week 8. When you have the bye week for at least both of those teams still to come, it's relatively easy to reschedule the games. The problem for the NFL comes when the Titans have to reschedule another game, or you have a team that has already passed its bye week. Starting in week 5, you're going to have about 4 teams a week on their bye weeks. We have 4 teams on their bye this week, four teams on their bye in week 6, and so on as we progress through the NFL season. But as we get past teams having their bye week, now the Tennessee Titans are in this position where if you have to postpone another game for the Tennessee Titans, you're going to get to week 17 and you're not going to have all 16 games played. And it's not like a different sport like baseball where you can do the double headers, or the MLS in soccer where you can play 2 or 3 games in a week and you can do some squad rotation and those players are going to be fine. Football is a whole different breed of sport. Football is built different as a sport, and the athletes who play it, it's incredibly, incredibly hard to be able to play more than once a week, and it's just too hard on a human body. The amount of bruising and hits and all of the physical play that happens in an NFL game from start to finish, it's just incredibly, incredibly hard on those players, and it's just not feasible to try to play any midweek games, to play on a Sunday, a Wednesday, and the next Sunday for the Tennessee Titans. It would be almost impossible to pull off. So it's going to start getting tougher if the Titans are forced to reschedule again. The Titans-Bills, I think that's who they were supposed to play this week. Titans-Bills got pushed back a little bit. That game is either being played on Monday or Tuesday now. The NFL still hasn't really decided what they're going to do in that situation. Best case scenario, that game gets played this week, but ultimately, the NFL is going to have a decision to make at some point, whether it's with the Titans this week or whether it's with a different team later in the year. But there's going to be a moment where a team is already past its bye week and they're going to need to play another game. And by the time you're going to get past week 17, which is where the normal schedule sits right now, you're not going to be able to have all 16 of your games played. And so the NFL is going to have a decision to make, and I'm surprised they haven't already made this decision, but this was an idea proposed on ESPN, on an ESPN article talking about the recent outbreak of COVID-19 in NFL locker rooms. But on ESPN, they suggested, why don't we extend the season? But instead of extending the season and just putting the replayed games on a week 18, because that's what we're going to call it, in that extra added week, instead of doing that, because the problem with just adding the rescheduled games in week 18 is those teams that are getting a bye in the first round of the playoffs, so the first seed in the NFC and the first seed in the AFC, they would have 3 weeks off from games, and potentially even 3.5, because in week 17, if they have that number 1 seed already locked up, they're not going to be playing any starters. So they would have that week 17 off for their starters. They would rest their starters in week 17. That week 18 rescheduled bit of games would be a bye week. The wild card round would be a bye week, and then they finally have to play in the divisional round. But 3 full weeks of bye week is too long. A 3-week break between games is too long for some of those teams, or for whatever teams end up in the first, or as the first seed in the NFC or AFC. So what this ESPN article suggested was moving all of the week 17 games, all of the week 17 fixtures right now, which are almost all divisional matchups, moving that set of games to week 18 and designating week 17, whatever those dates are right now, designating that week as the week for all of the rescheduled games to take place. Say the Titans-Bills gets rescheduled this week and they're not able to play because the Tennessee Titans get yet another positive test on Sunday or Monday or the day before, whenever it was scheduled to be played. They're going to have to most likely create that extra week, that buffer zone for teams to be able to reschedule games at some point before the end of the season, because the NFL is not going to forfeit these games. They're not going to have any teams at the end of the year that haven't played all 16 games. The NFL gets their paycheck. The players get their paycheck only when the game is being played. The NFL is going to do whatever they can to get their games played. And ultimately, the NFL is a sport that you can play in the wintertime, and the season goes essentially into the first week of February. The Super Bowl's in the first week of February. Then you have a really long off season. So extending the season by 1 week, I don't think is going to be too detrimental long-term for the NFL. And ultimately, if the NFL, I don't want to say if, because I think it's going to happen, when the NFL is forced to reschedule a game for a team that has already had a game rescheduled or has already had their bye week, I think they're ultimately going to have to create that week 18 and move some games around so that they're able to designate a week for those rescheduled games to fit into near the end of the season. We've had a few rumblings of ideas from what I like to call Crazy Town. We've had a few ideas of bubbles or chipping the players. Now, we'll start with chipping the players. There was at least one or two articles floating around online about potentially chipping the NFL players and monitoring where they are, their locations, what they're doing, what kind of events they're attending. And no, the NFL is not a communist country. We're not going to chip all of the NFL players to figure out what they've been doing and where they're at. That seems like an incredible invasion of privacy to me. And I don't think that the players are going to be in hotel bubbles. There was also this idea of keeping all the players essentially locked in hotels, or at that point they're almost like prisons, and the only time that players can go outside of the hotels is for practices, home games, and away games if they're traveling or if they're staying at home, which no player is going to agree with that. They would be trapped in those hotels for over 3 months. The players want to be with their families, and there's absolutely no way the NFL is going to try to keep all of these teams essentially quarantined for the entire length of the NFL season in these hotels. I mean, these players are going to be within their local communities. They're going to be with their families, and their families, maybe they have kids that are going to school. These players are going to, at some point, possibly be exposed to the virus. And I think going into the year, that's a risk the NFL was willing to take. And the NFL's strategy going into this hasn't been fully keeping out COVID from the entire league. If that was the ultimate goal, they probably would put players in a hotel for the length of the season, and then you'd see a massive number of players opt out for the season because they don't want to be away from their families for that long. The strategy for the NFL going into this season was, obviously we want the players to be as safe as possible in their communities, as safe as possible around their families, as safe as possible as far as how many people they're seeing on a daily or weekly basis. But the NFL went into this saying, look, coronavirus is going to hit, COVID-19 is going to hit the league at some point. There's going to be a team, there's going to be a few players that are infected across the league. Our strategy going into the year is going to be to try to stop quick spreads from happening, or stop entire squads, entire teams at one time getting it. Because what we saw between the Patriots and the Chiefs last weekend is we saw Cam Newton get COVID-19, but he was the only player on the Patriots that tested positive for COVID-19, and the rest of the team was still able to play the game against the Chiefs last week. Now, the Patriots were a significantly worse team without Cam Newton, but those are the types of sacrifices we're going to have to make this season to get all of the games played. If you only have one player that tested positive for the virus, he's now quarantined at home, the rest of the team, as long as they continue to test negative, should continue playing games and staying on track, on schedule for this NFL season. And it's not like the NFL would ever attempt something similar to what the NBA did, like a bubble, the NBA moving everybody down to Orlando. The NFL, there's just way too many people. The scale of the operation would be massive compared to the NBA. First off, the NBA only had 2 courts, because when you're able to play games every 2 or 3 days, you're able to schedule games at different times in a way that the NFL's schedule just doesn't allow that. The NFL has 8 or 9 games on every Sunday, the early slot of Sunday games, whether that's the morning if you're on the West Coast or the early afternoon if you're on the East Coast, but it's just not feasible. Also, because the NBA only brought 22 teams, it was the teams that were still essentially eligible to make the playoffs were the ones that were thrown into the bubble. All of those teams with all of those players added up, coaches and management, all of that whole group of people added up to what ended up being a little over 800 people, which is a lot, and it's hard to put 800 people in a bubble, but it's doable in Orlando when you have that many hotels and that many places that you can store players. The problem with the NFL is the NFL would have to bring all 32 teams. The NFL has at least 3 times, 4 times as many players on an active roster that the NBA does. And so the NFL would have to bring upwards of 3,000 people, and I think it's going to be even more than that. It would probably be 3,500 people if they really wanted to bring everybody that they had to into a single bubble. That's just not possible. You really can't get away with doing that, and so I don't see the NFL ever trying anything like the NBA bubble in Orlando, even come playoff time when you have less teams. It just doesn't seem logical at that point to throw everybody, all of these NFL players, in one location. And going forward, I think the main point that I wanted to emphasize is the NFL is going to continue doing what they see best for the course of the year to try to get all of these games played and keep all of the players safe. This has been well thought through. The NFL was put in sort of a blessed position compared to some of the other professional sports leagues in the fact that this pandemic hit essentially right after their season ended, like a month after the Super Bowl was when coronavirus first really started hitting and shutting things down. So the NFL had the whole summer, most of spring, the whole summer, to think about how they were going to approach this season with COVID-19, what kind of procedures, protocols they were going to put in place to try to keep all of these players safe and get their paychecks, get the season played. But like most of 2020, it's a difficult situation, and we're going to have more outbreaks within the NFL before the season's over, and the NFL is going to have to find a way to navigate through that. We'll keep an eye on it. We'll have to see if the NFL decides to add an extra week to the season, add a week that's dedicated to simply games that are going to be rescheduled due to teams contracting the virus. And we'll just have to watch and see how the NFL tries to navigate through the rest of what we've got 12 weeks left, 13 weeks left at this point now that we're heading into week 5, and then you have playoffs after that. All right, let's talk about the Seahawks and the Vikings now, the preview of the week 5 matchup. It's Sunday Night Football again for the Seattle Seahawks, which is pretty cool. Pete Carroll is 6-0 against the Vikings. I thought that was a pretty interesting stat that I read going into it. Blair Walsh's missed kick in the playoffs is the only thing really keeping that streak alive, that wide left Blair Walsh miss that essentially sent the Seahawks through in, 2016 or 2017, whenever that was one of the many playoff heartbreaks for the Minnesota Vikings in recent years. I think the Minneapolis Miracle, the Minneapolis Miracle is one the Vikings won, but so my apologies, but the Vikings have had some other heartbreaking playoff losses in recent history, but Blair Walsh keeping Pete Carroll's undefeated record alive against the Vikings. So let's talk about what I'm looking for in week 5, what really is going to stand out to me in this game against the Vikings. And the first off is the bounce back, if you want to call it a bounce back, essentially for the Seahawks passing game. A slightly slower week in Miami. I wouldn't call it a bad week. It was still a productive week for Russell Wilson, for DK Metcalf, for David Moore. But we did see a few drops. I think Tyler Lockett dropped 1 or 2. We didn't see any huge plays from DK Metcalf. He did top 100 receiving yards in the game, but he had no touchdowns, no big explosion type plays that we're used to seeing from DK Metcalf. But this week against the Vikings, you're going against another secondary that's really beat up. The Vikings still have Harrison Smith and Anthony Harris, which is a dynamic safety partnership, but they can only cover so much ground in the middle of the field. If you talk about the corner position for the Minnesota Vikings, they have plenty of injuries that they are dealing with there. So Russell will be looking for those one-on-one opportunities between those backup Minnesota cornerbacks and his players like Tyler Lockett, like David Moore, like DK Metcalf. That's going to be the number one place that the Seahawks try to sort of expose this Vikings defense in week 5. Let's talk about the Hawks' run defense now. The Minnesota offense may set up well against the Seahawks, or it may be another rough week where the Seahawks defense continues to concede 30 points a game. But this year, up until this point, the story for the Seahawks defense has been that against the pass, they're really bad, and against the run, they've been pretty good, I would say. But Minnesota is a running first team. Dalvin Cook, the running back in the backfield for the Minnesota Vikings, is having a monster year. He's leading the NFL in rushing yards right now. He's been a good target in the short passing game out of the backfield for the Vikings up to this point, but Kirk Cousins isn't really the type of quarterback that's going to throw it all over the yard on you. If Kirk Cousins tries to throw it all over the yard on you, he's prone to mistakes, so look to that Seahawks secondary like Shaquille Griffin, who's been playing well in recent weeks, like Ryan Neal, our guy who's just been called up from the practice squad and been playing really well. It's really fun to watch Ryan Neal get 2 interceptions in the last 2 weeks and been playing so well. He's been getting some work with Cam Chancellor recently, I read online somewhere, but the Seahawks are still missing Jamal Adams and Jordan Brooks for this game, which should make running easier a little bit for Dalvin Cook in this game. Jamal Adams and Jordan Brooks are both forces in the run-stopping game. I don't know if Damon Harrison Snacks will be ready for week 5. Pete Carroll has not made a definitive decision yet. We know that Snacks he was an all-pro. He was a pro bowler for his run-stopping ability. A few years ago with the Giants, he was one of the best, if not the best, run stopper in the game. We don't know if that's quite the same player. Snacks was a player that was contemplating retirement at the end of last year, so maybe he has deteriorated a little bit in his physical condition. We just don't really know where he is at right now. But the Vikings struggled to start the year. They got their first win of the season last week against the Texans. They are 1-3, and there's still plenty of holes in this Minnesota defense other than the cornerbacks, and they're still lacking offensive weapons other than Dalvin Cook. Stephon Diggs is gone. They considered him sort of a locker room cancer and got him out of town, and I think to be fair, Stephon Diggs wanted out of Minnesota. Adam Thielen isn't really what he used to be in recent years. He hasn't been quite the same reliable target that he was for Kirk Cousins in the last 2 years. But I do want to keep a special eye on Justin Jefferson. The rookie from LSU looks extremely, extremely dangerous with that big play ability that we see for so many young receivers. He looks dangerous. He scored a big touchdown, at least, I don't know if it was last week or if it was week 3, but he scored a huge touchdown that I think he mossed a DB and looked pretty good in that. So Justin Jefferson could be Kirk Cousins' new deep threat receiver, the guy that's going to be making big plays. So the Seahawks secondary will have to make sure they contain him and stay in that cloud coverage, letting nobody get beyond them. After this week against the Vikings, the Seahawks do get their bye week, so they'll be able to go all out this week against the Vikings. But looking ahead, coming out of that bye week, you're going to have most of those guys that are still recovering from injury, like Jamal Adams. You're going to most likely have them healthy after the bye week, but after the bye week, it gets really tough for the Seahawks. They have to play all 3 NFC West teams and the Bills in the first 4 weeks coming out of that bye. That's going to be the real teller. Those stretch of 4 games between, it will be week 7 and week 10. Those are going to be sort of the midpoint of the season. The 4 games that are really teller of, can Russell Wilson keep up his bid essentially for MVP this year? He's been extremely, extremely strong through the first 4 weeks. I would expect him to have another strong showing against the Vikings, like we talk about with the cornerback problems that they have. It's going to be those 4 games coming out of the bye week that are going to be the real teller of whether Russell Wilson's really willing to make that push and continue to stay in the MVP talk while you play those gritty games against your division opponents and the Bills, who have a very, very solid defense. We'll have to find other stuff to talk about on Around the Sound, I suppose, after we wrap up the Vikings game early next week. Then the Seahawks heading into the bye, so we'll have to dive into some other topics. I know the Sounders are cruising on top of the West right now, so we'll have to talk about them. So stay tuned to Around the Sound next week once we talk about something other than the Seahawks, if you don't just like listening to the Seahawks. But there's plenty of good stuff happening around the Seahawks, so we'll have to keep an eye on how it goes against Minnesota this week, heading into the bye, and then we'll get right back on that Seahawks coverage after the bye week in week 7. So I do want to give a quick mention, just a quick tip to the Husky quarterback situation, the ongoing quarterback competition over at UW. The battle is essentially between four guys. It's grad student Kevin Thompson, redshirt sophomore Jacob Sermon, who my money is on to start the year, redshirt freshman Dylan Morris, and freshman Ethan Garbers. And Jimmy Lake, unsurprisingly, said to the media that the position is undecided. Look, the UW coaches, including Jimmy Lake, might know who he thinks he's going to start for week 1 for the Huskies, but he's not going to tell the players that yet, and he's not going to tell the media especially that yet. They want competition within the training camp. They want those quarterbacks, those guys suiting up, getting the most as they possibly can out of their reps. If the Huskies announce their quarterback now, whoever that may be, maybe that kid takes a break off practice or doesn't quite go as hard as he's getting ready for the season. I'm sure Jimmy Lake and his staff want those guys going 100% all out in practice, showing what they can do. They want that competition because in that competition, with an environment that breeds competition, your players are more likely to be better after competing against each other through those 6 weeks of training camp or whatever the Huskies are going to get before they start playing in those Pac-12 matchups. Another note about the college football season in 2020, the NCAA has announced that the 2020 season will not count against players as far as eligibility goes, so we will see plenty of true freshmen used all over the place in Jimmy Lake's system, maybe on special teams or maybe late in games as you're rotating guys out. So I would expect to see a bunch of guys that probably would have been redshirted this year bunch of those guys being used all over the place simply because they can get away with it without using that year of eligibility. All right, let's move on to the Kraken now, and I don't think we've had too much time to talk about the Kraken since we started Around the Sound. Since the podcast started, there hasn't really been too much news, too much going on in the world of the Seattle Kraken after the name and after the branding was released, which after the name was released, I was a little bit scared for what the branding was going to turn into, but I have to give plenty of credit to whoever came up with the branding, the jerseys, the logo, the horn. The goal horn is, of course, the ferry that crosses the Puget Sound. All of the branding, everything that surrounds it has been totally awesome. I've been a big fan of everything that they've done with the Seattle Kraken branding as far as making the logo and uniforms goes. But outside of that, outside of the branding, there has not been too much news from the Kraken front, so I haven't really had too much of an opportunity to talk about them, but we did get a tidbit today. According to the Seattle Times, Climate Pledge Arena, which is the renovated Key Arena, has had its roof attached. We have new pictures of the construction showing its progress, seeing how the arena is being renovated, what it's going to look like on the inside, and I'm getting more and more excited as the arena continues to inch toward completion. You can really see more the most recent pictures of the arena. You can really see the progress that they've made, sort of what the upper bowl and the lower bowl are going to look like once everything is set and done. And the arena is still on track to open in August or September of 2021, which is cutting it close a little bit, assuming that the 2021 NHL season starts in November. But right now, as of right now, where the project's at, it should be ready to go for the Kraken in the 2021 NHL season. We also got a recent update on the 2020-2021 NHL season, which is the last NHL season that will not include the Seattle Kraken. COVID obviously pushed back everything in the sports world, hockey, of course, being one of those. We just were able to crown the Tampa Bay Lightning Stanley Cup champions in 2019-2020 season, so now the NHL is looking ahead, determining how long of an offseason these players are going to get before they hop back out on the ice for that next 2020-2021 season. It looks like they are going to try to start that season. That season is set to begin January 1st, 2021. NHL says that they still want that 82-game schedule, which probably means that it's going to be condensed at least just a little bit. As you shift the timetable, it looks like if they do play all 82 of those games, you're going to have still a little bit of a late finish compared to what a normal season would be, as you're trying to play just as many games, but you're starting in January 1st when you're normally able to start in November. I still would assume that 2021, the first season, the inaugural season for the Seattle Kraken, would most likely look pretty normal and start in November if the NHL is able to get underway on January 1st. That would mean that the offseason between the 2020 and 2021 seasons would be just a little bit shorter in that summer time frame. It would probably be from June or July to November, but I think that's doable for most of the NHL and its players. All right, we got through a lot. Wow, we grinded through that. We got talk about the Kraken for the first time in a little while, which really I love talking about the Kraken, but we talked about the Huskies a little bit, and then we talked plenty of stuff about the NFL, its COVID problems, Seahawks, Vikings week 5, so we have plenty of stuff that we covered. We have plenty of stuff to watch for coming up this weekend and plenty of news as the news cycle continues to churn. So thank you guys for sticking around through the whole episode. Again, if you like the podcast, please tell your friends. Please help spread the podcast, spread my show, spread my listener base. So anyway, stay safe and thanks for listening.